Hello, I'm Brian Fox. Welcome to my channel, I Hate Rock Music. And this video is going to be about an amazing band. Most of the collectors out there that really like the heavy stuff know all about Head Over Heels. Came out in 1971, one album on Capitol. Unfortunately, there's really not much information out there. Nobody's been able to interview them, and so we don't know much about the history per se. The band is Paul Frank on guitar and vocals, Michael Urso on bass, who moved on to Rare Earth, and John Brideau on drums, and a totally smoking lineup. When you listen to the album, they open with a song called Roadrunner, and it just comes barreling down the road. Incredible rhythm section. Paul Frank is a really stunning guitar player and a really great singer as well. You really can't do much better than a Detroit power trio like this. Paul Frank apparently had been in a band called the Mystics, and then he probably had a pretty high profile in Detroit. He's such a good singer and such a good guitar player. I wouldn't be surprised if he was a real hot commodity and probably could have put together a band pretty easily. But Capitol, of course, at that time had a lot of big success with a bunch of new signings, including Head, Hands, and Feet and Blood Rock, and most notably Power Trio Grand Funk Railroad. And so it really made sense that they would snap up a band like this um, in the wake of Grand Funk Railroad. So they put out that one album, 1971, on Capitol, and apparently, I have to guess that they didn't press very many copies because right after it came out, it was rare. I think it went out of print almost immediately. I heard it on the radio, and I kept looking for it and looking for it, never found it, and then finally, in a used record store in Philadelphia, went through the racks, and there it was for $3 or something, and I was so excited to finally get it. And it's everything you'd want. It's right up there with all the great obscure underground bands I've talked about. And had they stayed together, it seems like they would have had some success. And the other thing that's interesting about them is they did get some exposure. Um, they did a show in Cleveland with Frank Zappa headlining, and Humble Pie, Free, and Head Over Heels opened that show. But most notably, the Zappa John Lennon show that's documented on Somewhere in New York City. Found out later the two opening bands were Hampton Grease Band, who I love and I did a video about, but Head Over Heels. So really twisted Atlanta uh, jam band, and then this Detroit power trio opening for John Lennon and Zappa seems really strange, but what a great opening gig for them. And considering some of the high profile shows they do, it's surprising that there aren't some tapes out there floating around. But there's a couple live tracks on the album, and just scorching version of Red Rooster, and then a song called Circles with a lot of incredible guitar work. And the album's a little mixed in some ways. It opens up with Roadrunner, which is just consummate, and Paul Frank is just a stunning guitar player and just heavy riffing and got a great sound. And then there's a great heavy power ballad, I guess you'd call it, called "Right Away," and it could have been a radio hit. And it was such a good song that he ended up doing it with his band after Head Over Heels called Fresh Start. So there's two versions of that out there, and it's a really killer song. But the album moves on to another uh, heavy stunner called Question, and then there's the long live jam called Circles, and then kind of a quirky little tune written by somebody else called Matthew Moore, In My Woman, and it's a little more pop in a way, but it still packs a lot of punch. But I think if they'd kind of kept along with more material like Roadrunner and Red Rooster, it would have been even more consummate. There's only one ballad on the album, Children of the Mist, and it's really great. He's got a great vocal sound, vocal style, and it starts out kind of acoustic, and then it has a middle section with some great electric guitar work before returning to its acoustic bass. But a really stunning album. I really, of all the bands I talk about, these one album bands, and a lot of times I'm wishing they had put out another album, and Head Over Heels is a prime example of that. If they had put out another album in late '71 or in '72 or even in '73, I would love to hear it. Was such a killer band. Paul Frank is such a killer guitar player and a great singer and a pretty decent songwriter as well. And when Head Over Heels are at their best, they're as good as any of the bands I talk about, and definitely a contender for a top tier band. But one of the things that it's interesting, I just found out about probably about 10 years ago. I didn't know that Paul Frank, after Head Over Heels broke up, he was in a Detroit funk rock band that's really excellent called Fresh Start, and I did a video on them. But 1982, he actually popped up again in a band called Bruiser, and the pedigree is great. It's got Vinny Appice on drums, Carmen Appice's son, and he ended up, of course, in the band Derringer. But the two guitar players were Paul Frank and Ricky Ramirez, and Ricky Ramirez is a monster guitar player too. So to have both these guys in the same band, it's too bad the album didn't come out about 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years earlier. It would have been a total monster. But in 1982, it's kind of cheesy. It's rocking, but it's kind of cheesy in a way, and a lot of it sounds like second-rate AC/DC. But it was great to hear Paul Frank singing lead all the time. And Ricky Ramirez is an interesting character because he showed up in this band Bruiser, but in 1971, when he was only 16 years old, he was in Boomerang, a band formed by Mark Stein after Vanilla Fudge, and I'll be doing a separate video on them. And then I was really shocked because there was a band they tried to push in Seattle around 1978 called Stryker, and they were one of the first bands signed to Harrison. They did a showcase gig here in Seattle, and lo and behold, there's Ricky Ramirez. So I actually got to meet him and talk to him. But so yeah, too bad Bruiser wasn't at the right time and place, because with Vinny Appice and Rick Ramirez and Paul Frank is definitely a great lineup. But Head Over Heels, I know most people that watch my videos probably know all about them, but if you're a early '70s heavy rock fan and you've never heard Head Over Heels, you're definitely in for a treat. And for you collectors out there, of course, the album's almost impossible to get and fetches a good price. And then there's a single of Roadrunner. But there's also a Japanese version of it with an OBI and actually a Japanese picture sleeve for Right Away, released as a single. And I have those, and I love them dearly because it's so great when you get Japanese copies of some of these real rarities. And it's also good to know that records like this were released around the world. Head Over Heels was released in Europe as well with a laminated cover. I haven't been able to get one of those yet, but man, as I already said, of all the bands that I wish had put out a second album, Head Over Heels would be at the top of the list. Thanks for watching. I'm Brian Fox. Thanks for watching I Hate Rock Music.